All right, it's going. Yep.
Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending my presentation tonight for the need for reform in criminal justice sentencing. Today, my guest or my audience will be Martha Fisco, Kamara Batchelor, and Anna Esparza, as well as next to me will be Susie Grills. Starting off, this presentation will be discussing the history of controversy within punishment and sentencing. This way we can see the progress within sentencing and how it has been justified in the past for reform. After the reforms have been carried out, it is important to note that what is now controversial is what dictates the need for reforms in the criminal justice system. We're going to be talking about the controversies in the society and how sentencing can be improved, as well as what are the oppositions to the reform in the United States. Starting off, we're going to be going into the history of sentencing. Sentencing within the criminal justice system has evolved and been reformed countless times since the beginning of the justice system in the United States. There have been many controversial sentencing methods that have already succumbed to reform, and some of these involve changes to punishment and sometimes illegalization, which we'll be discussing further along in the presentation. In this section, we'll be discussing corporal punishment, prefrontal lobotomization, and early forms of the death penalty, and one of which has recently returned in the select states during this past year. Prefrontal lobotomization. So I chose this picture for the front of lobotomies because this is a picture of Jack Nicholson in the movie The One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is many people's only reference for what a prefrontal lobotomy is. In the movie, Jack Nicholson played a delinquent who was sentenced to life in a mental institution, and near the end of the movie, he was given a lobotomy, and he was basically in a vegetative state. Essentially, the lights are on, but no one's home, which is what the initial intent for lobotomies were, as they were used as a neurosurgery where the doctor could stick and pick up part of the frontal lobe in order to fix issues such as mental disorders and illnesses. But that did not happen, unfortunately. The lobotomizations in criminal justice sentencing began in the 1940s as an attempt to cure criminal tendencies. In 1947, Millard Wright was a petty criminal who had been arrested multiple times for robbery. During the pretrial sentencing, Wright was deemed to be a healthy and clinically sane person. Wright had received the surgery expecting to be part of a potentially dangerous experiment as his sentence and not receive any further sentencing. Once he appeared in court 1 month after receiving the surgery, the judges had changed and the deal had been redone so that he was also being sentenced after being exposed to this potentially harmful surgery. Later in the 1950s, it was argued by many scientists that lobotomies did not alter any part of the criminal's intent or the thought process of the person receiving the lobotomy. However, scientists had begun speaking out in regards to the controversy, saying that lobotomy is not an ethical procedure when it comes to sentencing and has no beneficial results and actually has horrendous side effects such as death, brain seizures, or brain tumors, seizures, dementia, and Alzheimer's. So 0 of what was proposed to happen, and several downsides that led to death. The next form of sentencing that has been reformed over the years is corporal punishment. Corporal punishment is something that many people know from probably your parents, have been dealt with in school, as teachers were known to strike a misbehaved student's hand with a ruler, but it was also that came from the punishments for criminals in sentencing. Corporal punishment was a punishment used to humiliate, injure, degrade, or inflict pain upon a criminal. It was used as a deterrent to stop others from committing a similar crime. It was seen as a violation of human rights due to the basically hazing of the person in front of others. The last time corporal punishment was used in the United States was in 1952, even though it wasn't abolished until 1972. Corporal punishments were able to cease 20 years before legal abolishment. So really the point here being made is that society put it to an end in 1952, but the criminal justice system decided that it didn't need to be put to an end until 1972. So how can society work together to assist in the reforms of sentencing so that it works for the values and ever-flowing change of society? Capital punishment is the death penalty. It has been a topic of reform for some time now and is an excellent example of sentencing being in a state of constant reform to match the goals of society. Many forms of the death penalty were seen as too vile to be administered to humans, resulting in the ever-flowing change of the death penalty to what society sees today as the lethal injection method. While some states still reserve the right to use a variety of different forms of execution, such as the electric chair, gas chambers, public hanging, and a three-man firing squad, those states receive a heavy backlash from society due to the inhuman effects of those sentences. So recently in the past year, Richard Moore has sat on death row since 1999, but in the past year, he was actually able to decide his method of death. When he was finally given his choice of death, lethal injection was not one of the options. In South Carolina, due to their Department of Corrections and their sentencing laws, a person convicted of a capital punishment and having imposed upon him the sentence of death shall suffer the penalty by electrocution or at the election of the convicted person by firing squad or the lethal injection if it is available at the time of the election, under the direction of the Director of the Department of Corrections. Moore was only given two options, the electric chair or death by three-man firing squad, as the state of South Carolina's Department of Corrections announced their lethal injection supply had expired in 2013, and they had no means of collecting more. After this information became public, knowledge employing the media, there was a large backlash from society deeming this death sentence to be unconstitutional. This backlash resulted in South Carolina Supreme Court issuing a temporary stay on Richard Moore's death penalty so that his punishment would be up for review. So this was able to be stopped by the media and society's influence and how much backlash they had given the justice system. But how many other sentences have slipped through the cracks due to lack of media coverage and transparency? Now we're going to be talking about the controversies in sentencing today. While there have been many changes to sentencing and punishment within the criminal justice system, society will always demand continuous progression. To obtain this progression successfully, the controversies in the system must be addressed. Changes in criminal justice are difficult to make without controversy, as issues are debated by those in society. As issues become controversial, it gives the criminal justice system a chance to improve processes. The death sentence today. As stated previously in this presentation, the death sentence has gone through many reforms to get where it is today. However, the ethics surrounding the death sentence are not the only factors contributing to its controversial nature. Other factors, such as how effective the death penalty is in deterring future crimes, the economic costs, and the impact it has on society, including the victim's family, along with the family of the accused being sentenced to death. The death penalty raises the other problem with human rights violations, and that it is irreversible. Looking at the Innocence Project, it has become transparent to society that many who have been convicted and sentenced to the death penalty only to be found falsely convicted after it was too late. Is that really justice? How does the death sentence increase deterrence? There are many videos of courtrooms and how people's reactions to receiving the death sentence. A lot of them have signs of relief and thankful that they're not receiving life in prison. And then another common reaction is disbelief, saying that they really didn't think that they were going to be given the death sentence. Many inmates serving a life sentence, in fact, beg for the death sentence. One example of this would be in the case of State versus Passaro. During this case, Passaro had a custody battle with his ex-wife, who's Karen Passaro, over their 2-year-old daughter, Maggie. When Passaro was supposed to drop Maggie off at her daycare, he instead parked his vehicle in front of Karen's apartment, doused the car in gasoline, and ignited it, with young Maggie still trapped in the car seat, burning her alive. During the trial, the plaintiff against Passaro fought for him not to get the death penalty, as that was exactly what he wanted. Passaro begged for the death penalty, as that meant a means of escape the punishment that would have been forcing him to live, knowing he had murdered his daughter in such a cruel and sadistic manner. The death penalty is seen as a more preferred than life to prison by the reactions of those receiving life in prison. Many inmates serving life are known to antagonize inmates in hopes of assisted suicide. Many regard the life sentence as a fate worse than death. Jeffrey Dahmer is one example of this, who had been known for antagonizing inmates, setting up his food as dismembered body parts of his prior victims. His efforts did come to fruition, as another inmate eventually beat Dahmer to death and stabbed him with a whittled down toothbrush. Here we're going to be taking a quick look at a video, if it will play. This is going to be Jeffrey Dahmer receiving his sentence.
Jeffrey Dahmer's murderous orgy is over. Throughout the trial that found him sane, grief-stricken families of the 15 men and boys Dahmer killed and mutilated held their peace. But today, before the sentencing, they had their day in court.
Did you ever stop to think that this is someone's brother, nephew, uncle, cousin, grandson, or just someone's friend?
I hope you can deal with what you've done. I'm trying hard to. You almost destroyed me, but I refuse to let you destroy me. I will carry on.
Destroyed the baby of the family? And I hope you go to hell.
Only the sister of Errol Lindsay was unable to contain her rage.
I don't want to ever see my mother have to go through this again.
After a brief recess, Dahmer addressed the court for the first time.
I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself. This was a case to tell the world that I did what I did not for reasons of hate. I hated no one. I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick.
Though he accepted the blame for his barbaric crimes, cannibalizing, even crudely lobotomizing some of his victims, Dahmer nonetheless asked for forgiveness.
I should have stayed with God. I tried and failed and created a Holocaust. And if I could give my life right now to bring their loved ones back, I would do it. I am so very sorry. I deserve whatever I get because of what I have done.
So as we saw in that video, Jeffrey Dahmer's request for forgiveness was in fact the death penalty, which was seen also in the case of State versus Passaro, where both men wanted to die over receiving the life in prison sentence, because life in prison meant they had to deal with the suffering that they'd caused on other people, where the death sentence means that it's not their problem anymore, essentially. Next, we're going to be looking at who are the real victims of the death sentence. Because as I just said, it's not, once you're given the death sentence, it's not your problem anymore. So what about the families who have not committed any crimes? Why do they have to suffer? Why are the families being punished while the criminal no longer has to live with what they have done to fellow members of society? How is this a deterrent? As far as deterrence goes, how well does punishment deter others from performing crimes when the people receiving them are content with their sentence or were shocked that they would receive the death penalty? General deterrence is almost entirely driven by the perceived certainty of punishment, while severity plays a much smaller role. Based on what Christopher Lewis stated in this quotation from the States in the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology, the execution of capital punishment, or the death penalty, is not working in a manner that is beneficial to the driving force of what makes a successful deterrent. If society saw a more transparent view of criminals receiving their sentence, would this work as a more beneficial deterrent for those committing or planning to commit similar crimes? The cost of death. When looking at the cost of death or the death penalty, society must keep the cost in mind. Many believe the death penalty to be more cost efficient, but this is actually the opposite. The monetary cost of the death penalty is extremely high. For a single death penalty trial, the state needs to pay more than $1 million more than for a non-death penalty trial. Of all the death penalty cases that go to trial, 1/3 of them results in a death penalty sentence, and only 1/10 of them result in an execution. So the cost and the impact on society weigh heavily on many citizens when it comes to changing the sentencing guidelines. And according to the American Research Journals of Social Science, the quote that I just read to you guys, this puts a lot of people through unnecessary duress only for capital punishment not to be carried out, wasting a lot of tax dollars going through the process. This process could have been handled much differently and more cost effective. This is going to be going into a completely different crime, the sentencing regarding sex crimes. In modern society, protection of the rights and freedoms of minors, including protection from sexual assault, is one of the most important tasks. This issue is becoming, without exaggeration, a real social disaster that threatens the safety of children and adolescents. Preserving the livelihood and human rights of adults, and especially children, is increasing the need for reform in the sentencing of sexual offenders to deter criminal acts and protect society from these vile acts against humanity. Sexual crimes such as rape and pedophilia are often regarded to be one of the most heinous crimes a human being can do to one another. Many see the sentence of chemical castration as not being a punishment, as it can allow the accused to live an almost normal life. That being said, society must remember that having to register as a sex offender is implied for all sexual-related crimes. Therefore, if a sex offender is sentenced to repeated chemical castration and registration as a sex offender, this raises another issue for the convicted. With the registration of a sex offender, some members of society react in an outburst of self-proclaimed vigilantism. How can society make its voice regarding the exploitation, treatment, and sentencing of sex offenders? Looking into the acts of the vigilantism when it comes to sentencing for pedophilia. Exactly. Many are familiar with the Leon Gary Plausch, who had murdered Jeff Doucette. Jeff Doucette was accused of kidnapping, raping, and molesting Plausch's 12-year-old son. While Doucette was in custody, being escorted out of the airport on his way to his court trial, Mr. Plausch came from the sidelines and shot Jeff Doucette in his head, killing him immediately. When looking at the video, which I decided not to put in this presentation because it was a little too heavy, you can hear the many people in the background scream, "Jeff, why?" Or actually, sorry, Leon, why, saying, why wouldn't you let him going to the sentencing when he didn't have faith in the actual sentencing of the criminal justice system? Also, how many fathers in America would do the same if they were put in that situation with their child? And how can the sentencing of sex offenders be reformed to deter the crime as well as the vigilantism in America? What is the three-strike law? The three-strike law is essentially how it sounds. It's being convicted of a felony 3 times, and it is automatic life in prison. In the years since the initial three-strike law, many critics opposed these mandatory penalties and called for changes. Stories of life sentences imposed for nonviolent crimes, such as felony theft, prompted many states to pass reforms of their original three-strike laws. So-called three-strike laws were yet another heavy-handed response to soaring crime rates with designs to keep career criminals off the streets. Many low-level offenders, however, received life sentences for relatively minor crimes because they'd had previous trips through the system. One thing that the three-strike law fails to recognize is the existence of wobble offenses. Wobble offenses are crimes that can receive either sentencing as a misdemeanor or a felony, depending on the discretion of the judge. Overcrowding of prisons is already a completely separate issue with the criminal justice system, yet the three-strike law is easily one of the best ways to overcrowd prisons and waste money on people rotting in jail instead of focusing on their restoration being productive members of society. What can make the reform a success? If the issues and controversies of the criminal justice system are defined, and there is a problem down to specific issues which need to be addressed so that reforms can be properly implemented, not only does it assist with making the reform as effective as it can be, it also uncovers and defines the reason why society needs the reform in the first place. In the bottom, you'll see, why was the criminal justice system so quick to react to defunding the police? Back in 2020, while the protests were going on, many people were calling for a reform, calling it the defund the police reform. However, in this time, the criminal justice system was very quick to react instead of thinking how this would have a negative impact on society. So the defund the police, what BLM and the other members of society were saying was we need to get rid of corrupted cops, get rid of the thin blue wall of silence, and clean up the justice system. But what happened was that a lot of cops just got laid off and then crime soared. So then why was the criminal justice system so quick to react to that instead of taking a step back and enacting it the way that it was proposed and not focusing on the other reforms as well that are in so much need for? Goals of sentencing reform. The main goals of the sentencing reform is to prevent human rights violations and progressing with the values of society while still upholding the goals of sentencing in the criminal justice system. The goals of criminal justice are rehabilitation, deterrence, keeping society safe, retribution, and incapacitation. Rehabilitation is important as it prevents the demonization of many offenders who are able to return to society and continue their life without recidivism or recommitting crimes and contributing to the goals of society. Rehabilitation can include therapy, diagnosis, and medication, as well as education and proper training for the workforce. Punishing offenders can mean both retribution and incapacitation. Retribution is a vengeful type of punishment referred to as an eye for an eye, meaning that the punishment they receive will match the crime they committed, giving justice to the victim and their family. Another form is incapacitation, meaning that the person being sentenced is going to be locked up so they'll never be able to commit a crime again because they are incapacitated. Creating a positive reform that assists in reaching all the goals in criminal justice while also saving money allows for a domino effect. This means that after the first reform is done, other aspects of the criminal justice system can also have excess funding allotted to them so that other reforms can now take place. Society must align with the reform and goals as well, as this builds confidence in the criminal justice system. This creates more support and allows society to progress towards common goals instead of pushing back against the criminal justice system, stirring civil unrest. Fixing the system. So 5 key topics to fixing the system would be transparency, less deviation, ridding of the 3-strike law in general, incapacitating sex offenders while raising awareness for mental health, and possibly looking for the media to affect this as well. Oh, sorry. I'm gonna go back one slide. Okay, so transparency involved with fixing the system is, as I had stated earlier, with the sentencing and making it more aware for those who are thinking of committing future crimes. So seeing these videos online or understanding the price of committing a crime would be more of a deterrent for future criminals. Less deviation. There's a lot of deviation within sentencing guidelines that allows judges to make more choices than what they should, which would make them look racially biased or, as stated earlier, go for wobble offenses and putting people in prison for life instead of giving them the misdemeanor that they had the opportunity to. Ridding of the 3-strike law, this can be dealt with in general by just having progressive sentences, meaning that every strike they can get an increased sentence, not necessarily have to be a life in prison sentence, but just harsher punishment each time. Sex offenders should be incapacitated for their vile crimes against humanity, while also raising awareness for mental health. What this means is that while committing violent crimes against children is illegal, the thought or being a pedophile is not a criminal offense and is actually deemed as a mental illness. And there are several websites that need to be made more aware for these individuals so that they can get the mental help they need. A lot of them are on One Stop. It is onestopminorattracted.com, and then they can get many outsourced resources to get help for this. And then as well, the media has had a lot of impact on how society comes together. So how can they affect this as well and fix the sentencing issues? Despite the many reasons as to why society is in dire need for a reform, there are still many people that oppose this reform in sentencing. Many people support the death sentence and use the argument that it was founded on the philosophy an eye for an eye, and it should be used for anyone who commits first-degree murder. This philosophy is based on karma and vengeance. A person who does an unjust crime against another member of society should be forced to meet the same fate as their victim, but is it truly worth it or even beneficial to society other than getting revenge for murder? The short answer is no. It is not worth it in both a monetary and sentimental sense. It takes a great toll on funds, it does not bring the victim back, and some may argue it gives the criminal a way out, as I had stated earlier. Some people are also simply just afraid of the word reform, meaning that the way they know everything is changed, and some believe that that is scary. Some people just don't like change. The best thing that can happen with that is just educating them on what is wrong with the system, as so that in hopes that begin to understand what needs to change as well, so that they can form their own opinion. One good example of that is the media and how they are really good at uncovering injustices in society. And as well as stated before, many see life in prison as a fate worse than death. The criminal can be made to live with their thoughts on what they had done for the rest of their lives instead of being given a way out. This is my conclusion. Thank you guys so much for attending. This presentation has overall discussed the history of sentencing and its reforms, current controversies, and the arguments for a much-needed reform today, the goals to be obtained through reform, and why some may oppose it. These have been my resources that I've used to gather the information for you today. Are there any questions? If there are no questions this time, this concludes my presentation. Thank you guys so much for coming. Okay, you guys can unmute now.